This is Intel's Core i5-12400 and this is AMD's Ryzen 5 3600. Let's go compare them. AMD launched the Ryzen 5 3600 in 2019. Exactly the same year, Intel had come up with this, the Core i5-12400F. Let's see how far Intel was behind when AMD cared about the budget market and how far Intel has managed to pull forward. Now all of these processors are hexa core SoCs. Two of them, the 3600 and the 124, have hyper-threading, while the 9400F is a 6-core 6-threaded chip. They are so close but so far apart. Also, here's a long list of all the benchmarks we will be running. So let's get talking. Things will get fuzzy. Time for Cinebench R23. Let's look at the score of the 9400F. It manages to get a respectable 1061 in single core performance. The 3600 surpasses it for 1153. Now, guess what the 12400 scored? 1300? 1400? No, 1704 points. The multi-core performances paint a similar idea, with the 9400 being far behind the 3600 and the 12400. This is just the start of your humiliation, little boy. Geekbench isn't that taxing on the 9400F. The single-core performance is quite competitive and it is very close to that of the 3600. But the multi-core performance of the 9400F is in the mud. This is where the 12400 comes in. Intel has come a long way. Moving on to the latest Blender test suite, the 3600 manages to score 144.24 points. The 12400 beats the crap out of it and gets 168.39 points. And well, the 9400F is quite behind. Okay, enough of synthetic benches. Now let's see how these chips perform when coupled with an entire system. Yes, I'm talking about PCMark 10. And here we see the 9400F play a catch-up game with the 3600. The scores are still like 500 points apart, but that difference is almost negligible when you compare the difference the 12400 made with the 3600. Intel is going all in. Let's look at a couple of GPU benchmarks now. Now the only reason I'm including GPU benchmarks is to show how much of a performance difference a different chip can create. Oh, and before I dive right in, the GPU that I will be using is the Inno3D IGLX4 RTX 3070. Okay, time for 3DMark Fire Strike now. The 9400F manages to score of around 22,000 and the physics score is in the upper 11,000s. The 3600 beats the 9400F out of the question, and yeah, we're looking at a big difference. The 12400 does not improve the overall score by a huge margin. I mean, yeah, the difference is over 1,000 points, but the physics score gets a massive boost and it shoots up to almost 24,000 points. The Alder Lake scores are really showing their true might here. I wasn't initially planning to include the 3DMark TimeSpy results in this video, but I have something interesting to share. The overall scores paint a similar idea, the CPU scores also continue the same trend. But just look at the subtle differences in the graphics score. This proves that pairing a powerful chip with any graphics card will improve the latter's performance. After all, overkill hardware isn't a complete waste. Oh, and the 3600 is an unlocked chip, which means that it can be overclocked while the Intel chips cannot be. So I tuned my 3600 to the most performing overclock, and that was 4.35 GHz on all cores. This ended up boosting the score to the mid 12,000s, bringing it even closer to the 12400. Okay, let's wrap the benchmarks up with Superposition. This is another hardcore graphics card benchmark. And here we see the 9400F beat the 3600 by a small margin. The 12400 manages to be a bit better than the 3600 and the 9400F, but overclocking the 3600 gives the chip a solid lead. So what does all of these results tell you? Well, if you look closely, the 3600 and the 9400F are quite apart in terms of performance, other than these two tests, 3DMark TimeSpy and Superposition. And both of these tests are graphics card benches, with 3DMark TimeSpy putting a lot of focus on how games will run on your system. Even 3DMark recently changed the tagline to the gamer's benchmark. All of these suggest one single thing. The single core performance of the 3600 and the 9400F are quite close. And the single core performance marks that we got from R23 and Geekbench also support this theory. Now this brings me to the multi-core performance of these chips. Both R23 and Geekbench show that the 9400F is significantly behind the 3600. Now look at the 12400. I love how the tables have turned. Now multi-core performance is great for productivity. Say you're rendering a 4K video in Premiere Pro, or you're rendering a very complex character in Autodesk Maya. In both of those cases, multi-core performances will decide how smoothly you get your job done. And Intel's chips, as you saw with the 9400F, lagged in this aspect. But Intel did not let that be a rule, and the 12400 is the embodiment of how Intel has really improved their formula. Now let's come back to the single core performance. Wasn't that a bit messy? Now, what do you need single core performance for? Well, it turns out that most modern AAA games will not use more than 1 or 2 cores at any given time. So that means the stronger a single core of a processor is, the smoother a game will run on your system. And this is where the 3600's lead over the 9400F almost dies. You don't have to take my word, I have tested 10 games in total, old games, new games, multiplayer games, offline single player games. So let's have a look at the performance. Now I will be testing all of these games at 1080p. Why? Because at this resolution, almost each and every game is the most CPU bound. Because rendering a 1080p frame for a 3070 is nothing. And thus we can tell which CPU is holding back the graphics card the most and land at a conclusion. Starting with Cyberpunk 2077, we see a modest increase in performance as we go from the weakest to the strongest chip on the list. Now this game is extremely GPU intensive, so that is one aspect to look out for. Now Witcher 3 is an old game, right? But I loaded a bunch of graphics mods to make it look something like this. Now let us look at the performance. They paint a similar idea. Yes, the 12400 manages quite a few frames more than the 3600 and the 9400F, but it isn't something crazy. But can the 12400 run Crysis? Oh, no. Not the latest Crysis remastered. Let's go back in time. Yep, 2013? That looks good. Crysis 3? It should be a breeze, right? Okay, now Crysis is just too intensive. We see the same thing over here again. Okay, now let's flip the coin. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is a beautiful game. God, it is going to turn 4 already. And in this game, you can see the dire opposite of what we saw in Cyberpunk and Witcher. The 9400F and the 3600 are quite close in terms of performance, but the 12400 is in a league of its own. 30 more frames? Even RGB does not give you this much increase in performance. Moving on, PUBG shows the same thing, Halo Infinite isn't an exception, Fortnite does the same, Battlefield 1 pushes the 12400 to the moon, and F1 2019 just takes it to Andromeda. And Warzone? Yeah, the 9400 just sucks in here. So what do you think? The 3600 and the 9400F weren't quite far apart, but the 12400 just spanks AMD's budget offering out of the question. But before I give my verdict on these chips, I want you to look at some other metrics like temperatures, power consumption, frequencies. Okay, I stop right there. Now it is clearly evident that the 3600 is the hottest running chip among all of these three. I was testing these chips with a fairly overkill Lian Galahad 360 white cooler, but any decent air cooler or even a 240mm radiator will give you almost same results. But Intel chips have barely gotten any hotter. Like the amount of performance gain Intel has been able to push in with almost zero increase in the thermal imprint is quite impressive. Now moving on to the power draws, all of these three chips are rated at 65 watts. Now that is a very decent number for budget entry-level chips. But the 12400 can pull up to 117 watts under maximum turbo power. So that is a thing to look out for. But in real life, we just get an altered version of the temperature graph. The 3600 is consuming over 50 watts all of the time, while the 9400 and the 124 trail it by almost 10 watts all of the time. So be ready to spend more on electricity, 3600 users. Oh wait, I am a 3600 user myself. Okay, finally, let's talk about the pricing of these chips. The 9400F initially launched for $157 and I bought it for around 11,500 rupees back in 2019. The Core i5-12400, the one with the iGPU, sells for around 14,500 INR or around $180 in the USA. The 12400 is a bit costlier than that at around $200 and it is currently selling for around 17,000 rupees in the Indian market. The iGPU less variant, the 12400F, will give you the same performance at 2,000 rupees cheaper at around 15,500 INR. Compared to this, AMD has significantly reduced the price of the Ryzen 5 3600. Once it was selling for around 19,000 INR. In fact, I paid that much for my unit of the 3600. But now it is going for as low as 15,500 rupees. That makes this chip a very competitive offering. But the lowered price of the 3600 coupled with the fact that a decent B450 motherboard will cost you much lesser than a 12400 coupled with a decent B660 motherboard makes the 12400 even less value for money. Plus the 12400 also has the DDR5 advantage. In fact, I was testing the 12400 with 16 gigs of DDR5 memory installed because I just wanted to give it the best possible numbers it can push out. But the current pricing of DDR5 memory will scare anyone away. More so because DDR5 memory has almost no performance gain over DDR4, at least for now. Okay, so for the final verdict, I really like the way Intel is headed towards. 9400 had some serious problems. It did not have hyper-threading, multi-core performance wasn't demarked, but the 12400 seems to have fixed all of them. While AMD practically abandoned the budget hexa-core market for almost 2 years, Intel kept pushing more and more chips to the 10400, the 11400, and now we are here. But through all of this development and making their chips more and more powerful, I think Intel went a bit off with their pricing. The 12400 could easily have been priced a bit less. I think at this point it is a tad overpriced. Also, AMD is coming up with a Ryzen 5 5600 next month, so I can't wait to see how much of a performance increase that chip will be. The 12400 is insanely powerful, and I don't think this slightly turned down 5600X will stand a chance against it. But only time will tell. But although AMD might not take the budget crown with the 5600, the upcoming Ryzen 7000 series might change the tables forever. Now, if you want to know why I'm making such a bold claim, check out this video over here. Ryzen 7000 is going to be serious.